Arcarius, and welcome to the Torque Force. On March 22nd, 2012, a game was released for the Nintendo 3DS in Japan called Shin Hikari Shinwa Parutena no Kagami. The very next day, it would be released outside of Japan as Kid Icarus Uprising. It was the first new Kid Icarus game released since 1991, and the first release in Japan since the original in 1986. Despite being a direct sequel to the original in terms of story, it featured a completely unique gameplay style that is both loved and loathed by those that played it. I played the game shortly after its release, and over the course of the months that followed, it quickly grew to become one of my favorite video games of all time. If you're watching this video, that means 10 years have passed since its initial launch, and it is still held in just as high regard as it was when it first debuted, if not more so. That being said, many people are still unaware of its greatness. Most people are probably familiar with the game's characters through cameo appearances like in the Smash Bros. Series, and sales data shows that the game has only sold a couple million units total. Given both this as well as the fact that the 3DS eShop is going to be closing in the near future, making this game even harder to get a hold of, I wanted to make a case here for why this game is worth your time, and hopefully it'll end up being one of your favorites as well. Here's why you should play Kid Icarus Uprising. First off, a little bit of history about the game. Kid Icarus Uprising's lead director and designer is Masahiro Sakurai. You probably know him best as the creator of the Super Smash Bros. Series, which explains why Kid Icarus often appears prominently in Smash games. In fact, one of the reasons why the game even exists is because the game's protagonist, Pit, was introduced as a fighter in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Prior to the release of the 3DS, Sakurai was given a prototype of the console by company president and his friend, Satoru Iwata. This led to the creation of Project Sora, a collaborative effort between Nintendo and Sakurai's company Sora Limited, on a new game for the platform. Sakurai decided to make a 3D shooter, then chose Kid Icarus as the franchise given the fact that it had no new games in quite a long time. Despite having a large team to help him make the game, much of the experience, including the story and the gameplay, was mostly designed by Sakurai. Let's get the game's most controversial aspect out of the way first. As I mentioned before, the game's control scheme is probably what people don't like about it the most, and honestly I can understand why. Kid Icarus is a third-person shooter where you control both the main character Pit and his aiming reticle at the same time, but independently of one another. Since the 3DS only has one joystick, or rather a circle pad, the reticle is controlled using the touchscreen. This can create additional strategy in how you play, since you have to aim at enemies and dodge attacks at the same time, but many people were not a fan of having to use the touchscreen to aim. I would say this is probably because, at the time, the only model 3DS available was the original, and it wasn't the largest handheld out there. Since it was so small, many people who were using it had to hold it with one hand, and that could cramp up your hand if you were using it too much. In fact, even the developers knew that this control scheme would be an issue, since the original release of Kid Icarus Uprising also included a stand for you to put your 3DS on a desk while you were playing. Fortunately, as time went on, new and larger 3DS models were released, and I believe that the experience is much better when played on one of these. I would recommend playing on either the new 3DS XL or the original 3DS XL. The game will work on any model of 3DS, but playing on either of these is much more comfortable, and it allows you to appreciate the visuals far more. Moving on to visuals, I know not a lot of people are a fan of the 3D effect in 3DS games, but I've personally always been a fan, and this game is certainly no exception. The visuals really pop in this game when you're playing on one of the newer 3DS models, and the 3D effect really adds to the overall depth. In fact, one of the reasons why Sakurai wanted to make a 3D shooter is because he knew that the 3D visuals would look really good with that style of game. Sometimes the graphics can be a bit simple, given that it is one of the first 3DS games, I think that's excusable. But all in all, the visuals are really solid, and they really stand out from other games on the system. I highly recommend it regardless of your stance on graphics. Also on the topic of weapons, there are tons of different weapons to choose from, each with different strengths and weaknesses. While you will eventually find one that you prefer over all the others, it really is fun for the first few hours of the game to try out a wide variety and see which one you like the best. Weapons can also be enhanced by fusing them with other weapons, and sometimes you can even get special unique weapons through this process. All in all, it adds for great replay value to keep playing through all the levels in the game. Since there aren't a large number of them, you can go back and do different ones at different difficulties or with different weapons, and there's even different things you can find in the levels depending on what difficulty you have set or with what weapons you're using. So it's really fun to try and find everything that's hidden within the game. It'll work even after the eShop closes, according to Nintendo. Now, we don't know how long that'll be the case, so if you do pick this one up, I highly recommend checking out the multiplayer before it goes down forever. The mode is called Light vs. Dark, and I've heard people online refer to it as the most balanced multiplayer they've ever seen. I don't play enough multiplayer games personally to confirm whether or not this is true, but it definitely feels that way when you play it. Light vs. Dark is a 3v3 online multiplayer where your goal is to defeat the other players. If you defeat one of the players, that player then gets brought back to life as an angel, referencing the main game since you play as an angel. If you're then able to defeat the other player's angel, you win. But keep in mind that when the player is brought back as the angel, they have better stats and better items that they can use. So it really helps balance things out when you're in a pinch. Let's move on to what is perhaps my favorite part of the game, the story and its characters. While Kid Icarus Uprising is technically a sequel to the original Kid Icarus on NES, it quickly spirals into its own experience that requires no prior knowledge in order to enjoy. Each character is very well defined and goes through some kind of character growth as the game progresses. And of course, like any good story, there are plenty of twists and turns along the way. Honestly, thinking back to it, the story is structured somewhat like an anime. If you've seen Studio Trigger shows like Gurren Lagann or Kill la Kill, it has a very similar plot structure to those. At the center of the story are the two main characters, the angel Pit and the goddess of light Palutena. Rather than the typical dynamic you might expect from characters like this, these two are treated as equals in a sort of buddy dynamic. It's clear that they both respect each other, but each of them aren't afraid to say something harsh if the situation calls for it. The banner and the dialogue can also be very funny at times, with some jokes still making me crack up to this day. Apparently, in the Japanese version, the game has a much more serious tone, and Sakurai even told the English localization team that they could alter the writing if they wanted to have it better appeal for Western audiences. I'm typically not a fan of this sort of practice, as it is essentially censorship, but I'm willing to make an exception in this case because this dialogue is so well written and funny. For me, good writing is the kind that can make you laugh with characters in one scene and cry for them in another. Because make no mistake, while this game is typically lighthearted, it still can get serious when it needs to. The comedic and tragic elements mesh together really well, which does make sense given the game's roots in Greek mythology. I also think even if you don't like anime very much, the story is also westernized just enough in the English version to where the average person should still find it enjoyable. Another thing to mention is that despite this large amount of story in the game, there are actually very few cutscenes within the game itself. The dialogue is actually placed over the action, so you can take in the story without having to stop playing. The pacing is also done really well, so it never feels like you're missing anything important. There are also special hidden dialogues that can be triggered by meeting certain objectives in the game, and on top of this, the voice acting is top notch. Voice direction in video games can often be hard to get right, but somehow this game absolutely nails it. Each voice brings the exact level of quality you would want, and it's clear that these actors and actresses had a lot of fun during recording. Sadly, several voices were changed in their cameos in Smash Ultimate, and they don't quite hit the same high notes as the originals. I don't know what happened with that, but if those original voice actors are somehow watching this video, please return if Kid Icarus Uprising ever gets re-released in some way. I would love to hear your incredible voice talents one more time. Finally, to wrap things up, there's one more aspect of the game I want to talk about: the music. Masahiro Sakurai has shown time and time again that when it comes to video game industry talent, he truly has the connections. Kid Icarus Uprising brings together several incredibly talented composers to make what is quite possibly a masterpiece of sound. I briefly want to go over each of the composers involved and mention something notable they've worked on, just so you know what we're dealing with here. Motoi Sakuraba, known for the Tales of series, the Mario sports games, Golden Sun, and Dark Souls. Yuzo Koshiro, a longtime Sega composer known for Streets of Rage, Revenge of Shinobi, the East series, and the Etrian Odyssey series. Masafumi Takada, known for the No More Heroes series and the Danganronpa series, among others. Takahiro Nishi, known for the Grandia series. Noriyuki Iwadare, known for the Ace Attorney series. And finally, Yasunori Mitsuda, a legendary musician best known as the composer for Chrono Trigger, amongst many others. Sakurai managed to bring together all these incredible artists to create a soundtrack that is probably only outmatched by Smash Ultimate, which Sakurai also made and also has all of these composers in it. Each track in the game perfectly complements what is happening on the screen, and many tracks are intertwined with the action itself to the point where it almost feels like a film score. In short, if you're a music fan, I highly recommend you check this one out, or at the very least, listen to the music somewhere else. And well, there you have it. I could go on and on a lot more about how great this game is, but if you have never played it before, I really want you to experience most of it for yourself. It truly is something special, and it's the kind of game that we may never see ever again. Please don't sleep on this game. If you have a 3DS already, download it now before the eShop closes. Retail copies are already selling online for more than what they originally went for, and you can get the digital version right now for only $35. If you like the game, let me know, and I may consider doing a whole spoiler-filled discussion where I talk about everything that the game has to offer. But either way, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you back next time. Goodbye.